You sleep in a warm room, on an orthopedic mattress, and perhaps even under an electric blanket. Now imagine icy stone walls, wet floors, no central heating, and a winter draft blowing right in your face every night. This was a typical night in a medieval castle, where the temperature in the bedroom often dropped to levels at which we store food today. And yet they did not die en masse from hypothermia in their sleep, waking up in the morning ready for new achievements. How did people survive night after night in icy, damp stone boxes without modern insulation, antibiotics, or synthetic materials? Watch the video to the end, and you will learn what an inconspicuous interior detail saved kings from certain death and why modern people would not last a week there. What if I told you that everything you believed when looking at museum exhibits is not true? We are used to perceiving canopies and heavy curtains around antique beds as an element of luxury or decor. However, their original and main function was purely utilitarian and vital for survival. It was not just beautiful fabric, but an engineering solution to create an isolated microclimate. A medieval bed was a room within a room, a sealed capsule separated from the rest of the bedroom. Thick wool or velvet fabric, often lined with fur, created a physical barrier against the cold air. When the canopy was tightly closed, the volume of air inside was limited to a few cubic meters. A person's breath and body heat warmed this small space much faster than a huge stone hall. The temperature inside the closed canopy could be 5 to 10 degrees higher than in the rest of the room. The bed frame was often made massive, with a wooden roof called a sky, which enhanced insulation. Wood itself is a poor conductor of heat and served as an additional insulating layer. The bed was raised high above the floor to avoid the coldest layer of air that settled on the stones. The space under the bed was often filled with chests or bales to reduce the circulation of drafts from below. Inside such a structure, the air became stuffy and heavy, but this is what saved people from hypothermia. Ventilation in castles was natural and excessive due to the gaps, so the risk of suffocation was minimal, but the risk of freezing was enormous. People consciously sacrificed fresh air in order to preserve precious calories of heat. This was the only way to create a comfortable environment in a room where steam came out of your mouth. In the castles of wealthy feudal lords, multi-layered fabrics were used, with the outer layer made of thick tapestry and the inner layer made of thin linen. An air layer formed between the layers of fabric, acting as a thermos. Even if there was a draft in the room, it was relatively calm inside the canopy. For the poor people who lived near the castle, box beds built into wall niches served as an analog of a canopy. These were wooden cabinets with doors where a person could climb in and close the door from the inside. The gaps in the boards were caulked with moss or wool to prevent any heat loss. This design allowed the body heat to be retained for 6 to 7 hours of sleep without additional heating. In the morning, when opening the doors or pulling back the curtains, a person felt a sharp temperature drop, comparable to going outside in winter. In fact, the bed was the only safe place in the castle during the winter. All other rooms, except for the kitchen and the area near the fireplace, were unsuitable for prolonged immobility. The sleeping area was designed as an autonomous life support system. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. Could you sleep in a closed wooden cabinet for the sake of warmth? Write about it in the comments.
Even with the fire.
Are you ready to learn the truth about famous medieval tapestries? We are used to seeing them as works of art depicting battles and hunting scenes, but their main role was to prevent the castle's inhabitants from freezing to death. Stone has enormous heat capacity and high thermal conductivity, literally sucking heat out of the human body from a distance. Castle walls froze through in winter, and their inner surfaces were covered with frost or condensation. Touching such a wall or sleeping next to it was deadly dangerous to health. Tapestries and wallpaper were hung not close to the wall, but at a certain distance, creating an air cushion. This gap between the icy stone and the thick woolen fabric worked like modern thermal insulation in construction. The air in this gap cooled down, but did not actively mix with the air in the room, creating a buffer zone. The tapestry fabric itself was thick, dense, and heavy, often woven from coarse wool. It blocked the infrared radiation of cold coming from the walls and reflected some of the heat from the fireplace back into the room. Without this textile shield, it would have been physically impossible to heat the huge halls. In bedrooms, textiles were used to cover not only the walls, but also doorways and window niches. At that time, windows were often closed only with wooden shutters through which the cold inevitably blew. Heavy curtains were the only barrier to the icy wind blowing through the cracks in the shutters. The quantity and quality of fabrics in a room directly indicated the status of the owner and their chances of a comfortable winter. The complete upholstery of a room with fabric was called a chamber and could cost more than the construction of the walls themselves. It was an investment in survival, not just a display of wealth. Sometimes the fabrics were impregnated with oils or wax to reduce air permeability and protect against dampness. Moisture was the main enemy, as wet fabric loses its insulating properties. Therefore, tapestries were regularly removed, dried by the fire or in the sun, and dusted. In less affluent homes, simple coarse cloth or even woven reed mats hung along the walls were used instead of tapestries. The principle remained the same, to create a barrier between the living warmth and the dead cold of the stone. This system allowed the perceived temperature in the room to be raised by several degrees, which was critically important. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world where stone dwellings were also built. Where are you from? What if I showed you that the mattress as we understand it today is only a poor imitation of what our ancestors slept on? The medieval bed of a nobleman was a complex engineering structure consisting of many independent layers. Each of these layers performed a specific function in the quest for warmth and comfort. It was not enough to simply lie softly on something fluffy. It was necessary to reliably insulate oneself from the cold coming from below. Therefore, the bed was assembled like a complex construction set where every detail was important. The bottom layer was a dense weave of thick ropes or leather straps. They were stretched tightly over a massive wooden bed frame, creating a resilient mesh. This provided the necessary ventilation, preventing the mattresses from getting damp and moldy on the underside, where air stagnated. Over time, the ropes stretched and had to be tightened with a special wrench so that the bed did not sag like a hammock. The first rough mattress made of coarse fabric was laid on this rope net. It was tightly stuffed with long rye straw, which was considered the best material for the base. The straw created a thick air layer and served as an excellent primary insulator against the cold. It was a cheap and accessible material that could be easily replaced if insects got into it. The rustling of straw underneath was a familiar nighttime sound for anyone of that era. On top of the rough straw mattress, they put the main royal mattress, or feather bed. It was stuffed with selected down and soft feathers from waterfowl, most often geese. Feathers have phenomenal natural insulating properties, trapping warm air inside their structure. Such a mattress cost a fortune and was passed down as a great treasure. Servants were required to beat this feather bed every evening with special long sticks. This was done to fluff up the filling that had settled overnight and increase the volume of air inside. The fluffier the feather bed, the warmer it was for the owner to sleep on. Without this ritual, the down would clump together and cease to provide warmth. The wealthiest people used not one, but several feather beds at the same time. They placed one thick bed under themselves and covered themselves with another, lighter one instead of a blanket. This created a sandwich effect, where the person was surrounded on all sides by a thick layer of ideal insulation. The upper feather bed was heavy and pressed pleasantly on the body, but it was this pressure that helped to better retain heat. Sheets were made exclusively from linen, which has good hygroscopicity and perfectly absorbs moisture from the body during sleep. However, linen has a drawback. It cools the skin at first touch, which was unpleasant in winter. Therefore, during the cold season, woolen blankets or fur covers were often laid on top of thin linen sheets. Wool has a unique property. Even when it becomes damp with sweat, it continues to warm effectively. This was critically important in a damp castle, where the linen was always slightly damp. Special attention was paid to the numerous pillows, which were also tightly stuffed with expensive down. They were placed at the head of the bed almost vertically, creating a high mound. Sleeping in a semi-sitting position was considered beneficial for digestion and proper blood circulation at the time. But there was also a practical reason. It reduced the area of contact between the head and shoulders and the cold surface of the mattress against the wall. The quality of bed preparation was a direct and essential responsibility of personal servants. Poor work, such as a hard or cold bed, could be severely punished. Checking the bed for absolute dryness was a mandatory daily ritual before the masters went to sleep. Servants used special warmers and even their own hands to make sure there was no dampness inside. Moisture in bedding was deadly dangerous, as it could quickly lead to hypothermia and pneumonia. Therefore, the condition of the bedding was monitored as strictly as the quality of food. If the mattress did get damp, it was immediately taken out into the yard to dry in the sun, or the filling was replaced. In the constantly damp conditions of a stone castle, the struggle to keep the bed dry was a daily battle. This complex multi-layered cake was so effective that it allowed for comfortable sleep even in rooms with sub-zero temperatures. Heat loss through the bottom of the bed was reduced to an absolute minimum thanks to straw and feathers. A person deeply immersed in such a feather bed found themselves in a personal thermostat powered by their own body heat. Like this, if you also want to dive into a huge down feather bed right now. Something you've never seen in a modern wardrobe used to be a matter of life and death. We're talking about the famous nightcap, which in our current imagination has become a comical attribute of fairy tale characters. We are used to seeing it in illustrations in children's books, but for medieval people, it was a serious item. In reality, sleeping without a thick head covering in a cold medieval castle was deadly dangerous. It was the surest and quickest way to get meningitis or severe pneumonia. The human head is a biological zone with enormous heat transfer due to its developed network of blood vessels. In addition, the skull has virtually no fat layer that could serve as a natural insulator. When the entire body is covered with warm blankets up to the chin, the head remains the only exposed part. Precious heat escapes through this tube, negating the effect of the blankets. A long nightcap, often with a tassel or pom-pom at the end, successfully solved this problem. Men's caps were usually knitted from thick wool or sewn from several layers of soft flannel. The long tapered end of the cap, which seems funny to us, was used as a scarf. It could be wrapped around the neck for extra warmth and support. This reliably protected the throat and sensitive lymph nodes from the icy drafts that blew across the pillow. Drafts were omnipresent in the castle, and it was impossible to hide from them even behind the bed canopy. Women used thick bonnets of a special design that completely covered their hair and ears. These bonnets were tied tightly with ribbons under the chin so that they would not slip off during sleep. Often, several bonnets were worn on the head at once, using a multi-layer principle. The bottom layer was made of thin linen for hygiene so that it would absorb sweat and skin oils. The top layer was made of warm wool or quilted fabric for maximum heat retention. This system worked on the same principle as modern clothing for polar explorers or mountaineers. The cap was carefully designed so that it would not slip off during restless sleep. It had to fit snugly around the head without squeezing the blood vessels or exposing the skin. The forehead, temples, and ears were the most vulnerable areas, and protecting them was a priority. Earaches from colds were a frequent and painful part of life in the castle. Even in summer, people often continued to wear light linen caps in bed. This was done not so much for warmth as to protect the ears from insects. Mosquitoes and flies could be a real nuisance, and the fabric served as a reliable barrier. The absence of a nightcap was considered a sign of extreme poverty, ignorance, or recklessness. In old inventories of the property of noble persons, nightcaps are listed alongside jewelry and weapons. They were richly decorated with embroidery and lace to emphasize the status of the owner, even in the bedroom. But despite the decor, functionality, and the ability to keep warm always remained in the first place. The material for the cap was always chosen to be soft, but dense and warm. It was important that the fabric did not irritate the skin of the face, but reliably retained a layer of warm air. Soft merino wool or expensive cashmere were available only to the wealthiest feudal lords. Ordinary people had to make do with products made of coarse sheep's wool or felt, which were prickly but warm. This simple item of clothing allowed the whole body to maintain an effective temperature balance. Without a cap, the body would have to expend enormous energy resources to warm the cooling head. To compensate for the loss of heat, the body would reflexively constrict the blood vessels in the extremities. With a cap, however, the heat was distributed evenly, and the feet under the blanket froze much less. This was a law of physiology that people learned through bitter experience. Together with a long nightgown that reached the feet and woolen socks, the cap created a closed circuit. People went to bed dressed almost as warmly as we dress for an autumn walk. Not a single centimeter of skin was allowed to come into contact with the cold air of the bedroom. Thus, nightwear was not just underwear, but specialized protective equipment. It was clothing for sleeping in the extreme climatic conditions of one's own home. How did castle dwellers cope with the cold of their bedding before going to sleep? No hooks, just the harsh reality of cold sheets. Lying down in an icy bed in a thoroughly frozen room was not only unpleasant, but also really dangerous to your health. The sudden contact of a body warmed by the fireplace with cold linen caused an instant spasm of the blood vessels and uncontrollable shivering. This condition prevented a person from falling asleep and forced the body to expend a tremendous amount of energy to heat the space around itself. In conditions of calorie deficiency, this was an unacceptable luxury. Therefore, the procedure of preliminary artificial heating of the bed was a mandatory evening ritual in any decent home. The most common and effective tool was a special heating pad. It was a wide copper or brass container attached to a very long wooden handle. Outwardly, this device resembled a large frying pan with a tightly closing, perforated lid. Servants poured hot red coals taken directly from the fireplace into this container. Heat escaped through the holes in the lid, but the coals remained inside. A servant would move this warmer between the sheets for several minutes before the masters arrived. They made smooth movements up and down, trying to warm all the bedding evenly. Copper had excellent thermal conductivity and instantly transferred heat to the fabric, creating a cozy microclimate. The long handle allowed them to reach the farthest and coldest corners of the wide bed without getting into it. At the same time, it was extremely important not to hold the hot water bottle in one place for even a second. The slightest delay could result in the expensive linen being hopelessly ruined or burned. The ability to warm the bed correctly, quickly, and safely was highly valued among the servants. This required skill, as the hot water bottle was quite heavy. In addition to metal hot water bottles filled with coals, flat river stones or bricks heated in the fireplace were widely used. They were heated in the hearth and then carefully wrapped in several layers of thick woolen fabric or rags. Such improvised heat accumulators were usually placed at the feet under the blanket. It is in the feet that blood circulation slows down, and the cold is felt most strongly by a person. A well-heated stone could retain heat for several hours, slowly cooling down until morning. This helped to survive the coldest part of the night, when the fireplace in the room had already burned out completely. In the morning, the cooled bricks were removed so that the procedure could be repeated in the evening. This was the most affordable way of heating, which even soldiers used. There were also special thick-walled ceramic bottles filled with boiling water. They were also placed in bed in advance and worked as a prototype of a modern rubber hot water bottle. They were much safer than coals, as water could not cause a fire in the bedroom. However, water cooled much faster than stone, and the heat did not last long. The cork of such a bottle was often filled with wax to completely prevent the liquid from leaking onto the bed. For a pleasant aroma and additional comfort, additives were sometimes thrown into the coals of a metal hot water bottle. These could be dried lavender flowers, juniper, or other fragrant herbs. Warm air saturated with essential oils filled the enclosed space under the blanket. This helped to relax after a hard day and fall into a deep sleep more quickly. In the richest and most noble houses, special large frames were used. These were light wooden frames in the shape of a dome, which were placed directly on the bed above a brazier with coals. Blankets and sheets were thrown over this frame before finally making the bed. The fabric was saturated with heat and a slight smell of smoke, becoming completely dry and hot. The danger of suffocation or sudden fire was very real and frightening. Therefore, all warmers and braziers were removed from the bed immediately before bedtime. Leaving smoldering coals in bed overnight was strictly prohibited by safety rules. However, fires caused by the negligence of servants occurred regularly in castles. Poor people who did not have copper utensils used simpler and cheaper methods. They heated linen bags filled with clean sand, grain, or dry cherry pits by the fire. Such dry warmers retained heat for a very long time and easily took the shape of the human body. It was a simple but ingenious solution for survival in the cold. This complex ritual of warming up the bed allowed the body not to waste the precious first half hour of sleep fighting the cold of the sheets. The person immediately found themselves in a warm and comfortable environment. This contributed to falling asleep quickly and getting deep restorative sleep. What if I told you that the floor in the bedroom was not just a floor, but a giant compost mattress? The icy stone floor was the main and most powerful source of cold in any castle room. Walking on it barefoot or even in leather slippers was a real challenge for the body. The stone literally sucked the heat out of a person in a matter of minutes. To solve this problem radically, the floors in the living quarters of castles were covered with a thick layer of plant material. The main materials used for this were marsh reeds, river reeds, or ordinary rye straw. They were generously scattered across the entire floor in a continuous layer several centimeters thick. This covering functioned like a thick, springy carpet. It created a protective air layer between the icy stone slabs and the inhabitants' feet. Straw, being porous, does not conduct heat very well, so the floor became much warmer and more pleasant to the touch. In winter, the layer of reeds was deliberately made even thicker, sometimes reaching the ankles of an adult. This was done to insulate the room as much as possible from the cold coming up from the basements. Often, the plants were woven into coarse mats or rugs for convenience. They were laid out in the main passageways and areas around the beds, where people walked most often. It was a cheap, eco-friendly, and affordable solution that was easy to replace when it got dirty. Various fragrant herbs and flowers were often added to the straw. Peppermint, mountain lavender, chamomile, and sweet meadow sweet were used. This was done not only for a pleasant aroma in the room, but also for practical purposes. The strong smell of herbs was intended to repel fleas and lice, which inevitably bred in such loose coverings. The herbs broke when walked on and released essential oils. This slightly disinfected the air and masked the smells of dampness and unwashed bodies. It was a kind of aromatherapy combined with home insulation. People believed that the smells of herbs also protected against disease-causing miasmas. However, this effective method had its own dark, unpleasant side. The lower layers of straw, adjacent to the stone, could remain unchanged for months or even years. Street dirt, food scraps that had fallen from the table, bones, and other debris gradually accumulated there. This created a less than hygienic environment in which rodents could live. But in the harsh choice between dirt and deadly cold, people always chose the former. Warmth was valued more than cleanliness, since dirt could be washed away, but cold could kill. Only in the spring did they do a general cleaning, completely removing the humus from the rooms. The wealthiest castle owners, of course, could afford to change the flooring much more often. They maintained relative cleanliness and fresh air in their chambers with the help of a large staff of servants. In their royal bedrooms, bear skins or imported oriental carpets were laid on top of straw mats. This created a reliable multi-layered protection through which the cold of the stone simply could not penetrate to the feet. Dry reeds also excelled at absorbing moisture, which inevitably condensed on the cold stone floor. This prevented puddles and dampness from forming in the corners of the room. The plant layer worked like modern drainage, keeping the room relatively dry. And a dry floor meant dry air, which was super important for the overall feeling of warmth. In some northern regions, dry forest moss or coniferous fir branches were used instead of straw. Pine needles had excellent bactericidal properties and rotted less. In addition, they gave off a pleasant resinous forest aroma and retained heat better than hollow straw. Many people associated the smell of pine needles with comfort and safety. Such a living floor required constant and laborious care from the servants. It had to be regularly raked, topped up with a fresh layer, and rotten areas removed. It was hard and dirty work for the servants, but absolutely necessary for the lives of their masters. Without this simple layer of vegetation, The stone castle would have turned into an uninhabitable freezer in winter. How did people use their own biology for heating in such conditions?
Fire helps.
People in the Middle Ages were not individualists in our modern sense, especially when it came to sleeping at night. Sleeping alone in a huge cold bed was considered not only an unacceptable waste, but also downright foolish. The body of another living person was the most effective, reliable, and, most importantly, safe source of heat available at the time. The concept of personal space took a back seat to the harsh necessity of not freezing to death. Several people often slept together in one wide bed, creating a single thermal circuit. These could be spouses, their children of different ages, and sometimes random guests of the castle. This had no sexual connotations whatsoever, but was purely a practical solution to the difficult task of thermoregulation. The combined heat output of 2 or 3 bodies could raise the air temperature under the blanket to comfortable levels very quickly. A single person, on the other hand, needed hours to warm up the bed and still continued to freeze. Servants or young pages often slept at the feet of noble lords, acting as living hot water bottles. Their presence warmed the coldest area of the bed, where the feet would freeze the fastest. This allowed the owner to comfortably stretch out his limbs and relax, feeling the warmth of living beings. Large hunting dogs, whose normal body temperature is higher than that of humans, were also often taken to bed. The dog's woolly side warmed better than any hot water bottle. From a physics point of view, the human body emits about 100 watts of pure thermal energy during sleep. 3 people lying under a thick down blanket created a thermal effect comparable to that of a small 300-watt electric heater. In the confined space under the thick canopy, this resulted in a significant and rapid increase in temperature. The air there became warm and humid, which prevented the respiratory tract from becoming hypothermic. The dense arrangement of bodies in bed significantly reduced the total surface area through which precious heat was lost. People instinctively pressed their backs against each other, protecting the most vulnerable areas of the spine and kidneys. This resembled the natural behavior of animals in a herd, which huddled together in a dense pile to sleep in the forest. Collective sleep also provided a sense of psychological security in complete darkness. Of course, there was a strict and unspoken etiquette for sleeping together, which determined the rules of behavior. It dictated who had the right to lie next to whom and what clothing was appropriate to wear. Long nightgowns and caps created the necessary hygienic barrier between bodies. Complete immobility during sleep was considered a sign of good manners and respect for one's neighbors. Tossing and turning, pushing and pulling the shared blanket onto oneself was absolutely unacceptable. For single wealthy travelers or wandering knights, castles offered a special service. It was a bed warmer, a servant who lay in the guest's bed before his arrival. When the guest was ready to lie down, the warmer would immediately leave, leaving behind a warm and cozy place. Sometimes even the younger members of the host's family provided such services as a sign of special respect for the distinguished guest. Even ascetic monks in their icy stone cells were sometimes allowed to sleep in pairs. This was permitted during particularly harsh winters when the water in the wash basins froze overnight. The church authorities frowned upon this, fearing sin, but the real risk of the brothers dying from hypothermia was a compelling argument. A living monk was more useful to the monastery than a frozen, righteous man. Simple heat exchange physics worked flawlessly in these conditions and saved lives. Heat was transferred from the warmer body to the colder one and reliably retained by layers of woolen clothing and blankets. It was a perfect system of mutual survival based solely on biological heat. Proud solitude in a medieval castle bedroom was a rare and dangerous privilege that had to be paid for with excruciating cold. In our imagination, a fireplace seems to be an unconditional symbol of comfort, warmth, and safety. But in reality, a huge medieval fireplace was an extremely inefficient and capricious heating device. Most of the precious heat was simply thrown out of the chimney along with the smoke, heating the street. At the same time, the combustion created a powerful draft that worked like a pump. This draft sucked the icy air from all the cracks in the doors and windows into the room. This resulted in strong drafts that swept across the floor, freezing your feet. Standing right next to the open fire was unbearably hot, your face literally burning. But as soon as you moved 2 meters away, the air temperature dropped sharply and unpleasantly. It was a paradox. Your back was freezing and covered with frost, while your face was red from the heat. Fireplaces only warmed people through direct infrared radiation, hardly warming the air in the huge room itself. It was impossible to completely extinguish the fire in the fireplace at night, as it was difficult and time-consuming to rekindle it in the morning. But leaving it burning with an open flame unattended was deadly dangerous due to the risk of fire. Therefore, the coals were covered with a layer of ash for the night. This allowed them to smolder slowly until dawn, preserving the fiery heart. This provided a minimum of heat at night, but allowed the servants to quickly fan the flames in the morning. Special portable screens were used to protect against the treacherous drafts created by the chimney. Tall wooden, wicker, or leather-covered shields were placed in a semicircle around armchairs or beds. They were needed to mechanically block the flow of cold air coming from the doors to the hearth. The screen also heated up and accumulated heat, gently radiating it back onto the sleeping person. At that time, chimneys were often made very wide and straight to make them easier for chimney sweeps to clean. Because of this, in windy weather, cold outside air could flow freely down into the room. On such inclement days, the fireplace paradoxically became a source of cold rather than heat. Sometimes the mouth of the fireplace had to be completely blocked with bags of straw if the fire was not burning at that moment. The fireplaces in the reception rooms were truly enormous. One could stand upright in them without bending over. But their efficiency was negligible, not exceeding 10 or 15%. The remaining 85% of the energy from the centuries-old oak trees simply went up in smoke. It was a monstrous waste of resources, but people had no other technology. In order to make some use of the escaping heat, chimneys were sometimes cleverly routed inside the walls of neighboring rooms. A warm stone wall was a rarity and a real luxury, available only in the most sophisticated castles. People would press their backs against such walls, trying to absorb at least a little heat from the stones. The danger of carbon monoxide poisoning was a constant and silent companion to a night's sleep in a room with a fireplace. Poor draft, backdraft, or a chimney damper closed too early could kill sleepers unnoticed. Carbon monoxide is odorless, so people simply did not wake up in the morning. Because of this fear, bedrooms were always left minimally ventilated, consciously sacrificing warmth for safety. People tried to sleep with their faces turned away from the fireplace, even if it was far away. This was done to protect the skin of the face from drying out and heat if the fire was too strong. Thick leather screens were always placed between the bed and the hearth as a protective barrier. Thus, the majestic fireplace was more of a tool for daytime heating and cooking. At night, its role was minimized, and people relied on other methods of heat conservation. Here are the expanded versions of chapters 9 and 10. I have retained the structure, style, and all the key meanings, but have significantly increased the volume of text by adding biological and historical details. The text is broken down into easy-to-read paragraphs, each containing no more than 6 sentences. There are no lists or parentheses. A modern, pampered city dweller who suddenly found themselves in the real conditions of a medieval castle would most likely fall seriously ill on the very first night. Our ancestors had a completely different, more sophisticated thermoregulation system, which they developed from early childhood. They were born and lived in conditions of constant piercing cold, and their bodies were evolutionarily adapted to low temperatures. What is an extreme test for us was a normal environment for them. The basis of this amazing adaptation was the so-called brown adipose tissue, which we have almost forgotten about today. In modern adults, it has practically atrophied due to lack of use. But in people who live in the cold all the time, it remains active throughout their lives. Brown fat is a unique organ capable of burning calories not for energy for movement, but for the production of pure heat. It works like a built-in biological stove, warming the blood flowing to the heart and brain. Castle dwellers did not shiver from the cold at a temperature of plus 10 degrees, as we inevitably do today. Their metabolism was completely rebuilt for increased and constant production of internal energy. They consumed enormous amounts of calories, especially fatty and heavy foods, during the winter. Lard, fatty meat, and thick soups were not a whim of gluttony, but the necessary fuel to keep this internal furnace running. Severe hardening occurred naturally and inevitably from the moment a child was born. Children were never overdressed, and from infancy they became accustomed to the cold as the absolute norm of life. The threshold of sensitivity to cold in medieval people was significantly shifted towards low temperatures. What we today call bitter cold was for them simply fresh and invigorating weather. The body's vascular response also worked completely differently than ours. When cooled, the blood vessels in the skin and limbs constricted much faster and more effectively. This allowed hot blood to be instantly redirected inward, preserving heat in the vital core of the body. A knight's hands and feet might have been ice cold to the touch, like those of a dead man, but the person himself felt perfectly normal and alert. The second most important aspect of adaptation was purely psychological. Cold was perceived by people as an inevitable and natural part of life, rather than a disaster or discomfort. People of that era simply did not expect thermal comfort as we understand it, and did not experience stress from the fact that steam was coming out of their mouths in the living room. They knew how to ignore the cold by focusing on their activities. High physical activity during daylight hours also helped to get the blood flowing before bedtime. No one in the castle sat still for hours, as life required constant movement and labor. By evening, the body of every inhabitant, from servant to lord, was well warmed up by work, hunting, or military training. Muscular exertion was the best remedy for chills. The immunity of those who managed to survive a harsh childhood was incredibly strong and aggressive. Those weak infants who were genetically unable to tolerate the cold and constant dampness simply did not live to see adulthood. It was a harsh and uncompromising natural selection that left only the fittest alive. The population consisted of people with iron health. Seasonal changes in the body were much more pronounced than they are for us. With the approach of winter, people tried to gain weight, creating a natural layer of subcutaneous fat. It was a real biological armor against the cold, given by nature itself. Losing weight before winter was considered a bad omen and a sign of illness. Thus, medieval man himself was a different creature. He was more resilient, rougher, and wilder in terms of physiology. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not at all the continuous 8-hour rest we are so accustomed to today. People everywhere practiced so-called biphasic or segmented sleep, which also helped them survive in the bitter cold. The long, dark winter night was always broken up into 2 large segments with a break for active wakefulness. This was dictated not only by the lack of light, but also by the needs of the body. The first sleep began early, shortly after sunset, and lasted until about midnight or 1 a.m. Then the person woke up on their own, feeling rested from the day's work. They spent an hour or 2 being active, not trying to fall asleep again right away. This mysterious time was called the hour of wakefulness, or colloquially, the dog watch. During this period of nighttime silence, people prayed by candlelight, read books, or did quiet household chores. It was a time for quiet conversations between spouses, discussing plans and intimacy hidden from prying eyes. But the main thing they did was move. Movement accelerated stagnant blood, warmed cold muscles, and prevented the body from freezing in one position throughout the cold night. It was during this important break that the dying fire in the fireplace was checked and stoked with new wood. Servants replaced the cold hot water bottles in the beds with hot ones brought from the kitchen. People fluffed up their feather beds and rearranged heavy blankets that had become tangled, restoring order. This allowed them to restore the lost microclimate in bed before the second stage of sleep. The second sleep came after this break and lasted until dawn. It was usually deeper and sweeter, as the temperature in the stone castle dropped to its absolute minimum in the morning. Preliminary physical warm-up and renewal of heat sources helped to survive these coldest and most dangerous pre-dawn hours. Without this break, a person could freeze in their sleep. Such a broken rhythm was absolutely natural for the human body in the absence of artificial electric light. It was perfectly synchronized with the slowing down of nighttime metabolism and allowed for more efficient use of the body's resources. The brain rested in portions and the body received the necessary shakeup. Active wakefulness in the middle of the night also provided a legitimate opportunity to have a hearty snack. Food provided new calories for the production of internal heat, which began to dwindle around midnight. A piece of fatty cheese or dried meat eaten at night worked like fuel thrown into the body's internal furnace. Nighttime snacking was not a bad habit, but a survival strategy. Servants and castle guards also had their night shifts and patrol schedules. The constant movement of people through the castle corridors created a sense of life and control over the situation. No one was left alone with the frightening darkness and cold for too long. The footsteps in the corridor reminded everyone that the fortress was awake. Psychologically, two-phase sleep reduced the time spent in a helpless and immobile state. When falling asleep in the evening, a person knew that they would soon wake up, be able to stretch and warm up. This reduced anxiety and fear of the long winter. This habit, completely forgotten today, was an essential element of adaptation to the harsh conditions of life without central heating. We have seen that survival in an ice castle was not a miracle, but the result of a complex system of measures and adaptations. It was a combination of architectural solutions, textile technologies, biological adaptation, and specific everyday habits. People did not fight the cold head-on by trying to heat the entire castle, but created local oases of warmth around their bodies. Canopies, feather beds, hot water bottles, and nightcaps were all part of a single thermoregulation mechanism. Medieval people were masters at creating microclimates using the natural materials available to them. Their experience shows that comfort is a relative concept and that the human body has enormous reserves of strength. Which of these medieval life hacks do you find most reasonable, and which do you find unbearable? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new insights into the life of the past.